11 days. That is how long the most powerful Navy in human history operated without a civilian head. 3 carrier strike groups at sea, 2 inside active threat envelopes, 1 in the Persian Gulf, 1 in the Western Pacific. Combined displacement, north of 400,000 tons. Combined crew, more than 25,000 sailors. Combined firepower, enough cruise missiles, strike aircraft, and electronic warfare suites to dismantle a mid-sized nation's military in 72 hours. And at the top of the civilian chain of command, above all of it, an empty desk. No resignation letter. No successor warming the chair. An empty desk with the nameplate already gone. Because on April 14, 2026, Navy Secretary John Phelan was not asked to resign. He was told to leave, effective immediately. No transition period, no handover brief, no confirmation hearing for a replacement on the Senate calendar. Just gone. Every military channel on this platform is asking the same question right now. Why was he fired? Wrong question. The right question is harder and far more dangerous. What happens to the fleet when the firing is faster than the replacement? Here is the equation nobody in the Pentagon wanted to run. The United States Navy is unique among the armed services in one critical respect that most people, including most people inside the Beltway, do not fully understand. The Secretary of the Navy is not a ceremonial figurehead. The Secretary is the sole civilian authority for procurement contracts exceeding certain thresholds, for deployment extension approvals beyond standard rotation windows, and for force structure decisions that determine which ships get built, which ships get repaired, and which ships get retired. That authority does not automatically transfer downward when the Secretary disappears. It transfers partially, conditionally, and with legal ambiguity to the Undersecretary of the Navy, if one exists and has been confirmed by the Senate. In April 2026, the Undersecretary position had been vacant for 5 months. Let that equation settle. The Navy Secretary was fired. The Undersecretary seat was already empty. The next person in the statutory chain, the Assistant Secretary for Research, Development, and Acquisition, had been serving in an acting capacity for 7 weeks and had not yet received Senate confirmation. 3 layers of civilian leadership, all 3 functionally absent on the same day. Now here is why this matters operationally, not just politically. A carrier strike group does not simply sail in circles waiting for orders from Washington. It operates under standing deployment orders, rules of engagement approved at multiple levels, and operational plans coordinated through the combatant commands, CENTCOM for the Gulf and INDOPACOM for the Western Pacific. The admiral commanding the strike group has tactical authority. The combatant commander has operational authority. Day-to-day operations continue. But operations are not the problem. The problem is everything that is not day-to-day. We dug through the public procurement calendar for the Department of the Navy, the one posted on the Federal Register, and what we found was striking. In the 11 days between Phelan's removal and the announcement of an acting successor, 14 separate contract actions with a combined value exceeding $2.1 billion were scheduled for signature authority. 7 of those required the Secretary's personal authorization under Title 10. They did not get signed. 3 of those contracts involved maintenance periods for Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the backbone of every carrier strike group's escort screen. The destroyers were already in dry dock. The shipyard workers were already on the job. But without the contract modification signatures, the funding authority for scope changes froze. 2 of those destroyers had been scheduled to rejoin their strike groups by June. The yard work continued, but the paperwork didn't. And in the Navy, the paperwork is the mission. One detail that stuck with me in the procurement filings: a single line item, buried on page 43 of a routine budget adjustment document, authorized the purchase of spare rotor assemblies for the MH-60R Seahawk, the primary anti-submarine helicopter on every surface combatant in the fleet. That line item required a funding reallocation across two different program elements. Routine takes a signature and a phone call, except the person who signs it was cleaning out his office. Now, scale that up. The Ford-class carrier program, at more than $13 billion per hull, the most expensive weapons system ever built, was at a decision point. USS Enterprise, CVN-80, the third Ford-class carrier, was deep inside its construction timeline at Huntington Ingalls in Newport News. The construction schedule had been a source of friction between the Navy Secretariat and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for months. OSD wanted to push the delivery date to the right, delay it by 3 years to free up budget space for other priorities. Phelan, according to multiple defense reporting outlets, refused. Not quietly, he refused in writing. The restructuring plan would have stretched Enterprise's construction timeline from the current target of 2028 delivery to 2031. It would have reduced the annual funding stream by roughly $1.8 billion across fiscal years 2027 through 2030, redistributing that money toward unmanned systems procurement and cyber operations, programs with powerful advocates inside the Pentagon that do not put steel in the water. Phelan's position was not complicated. It was an equation. The Navy needs a minimum of 11 deployable carriers to maintain the rotation schedule that keeps at least 3 strike groups forward deployed at all times. With USS Nimitz approaching its decommissioning window and USS Dwight D. Eisenhower already deep into its final deployment cycle, every year of delay on Enterprise is a year where the carrier fleet drops below the sustainable rotation floor. Run that math. 11 carriers, 3 forward deployed. Each deployment cycle is roughly 7 to 9 months. Each carrier needs approximately 14 months between deployments for maintenance, training, and crew turnover. The arithmetic is unforgiving. Drop to 10 carriers, and the Navy either shortens maintenance windows, which accelerates hull fatigue, or extends deployments beyond 9 months, which breaks retention rates and drives experienced sailors out of the service. Phelan made this argument with spreadsheets. He made it with historical data from the carrier gap of the early 2000s, when the fleet temporarily dropped to 10 deployable hulls, and the deployment-to-dwell ratio for carrier air wings exceeded 1-to-1 for the first time since Vietnam. He made it clearly, and then he was told to leave. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. The Secretary of the Navy serves at the pleasure of the President. Firing a cabinet-level appointee is not unusual. In the first Trump administration alone, 2 secretaries of the Navy departed under pressure. Richard Spencer in 2019 over the Gallagher case, and before him, Ray Mabus's replacement cycle created its own turbulence. Cabinet turnover is a feature of the system, not a bug. But the feature has a prerequisite. You need a replacement ready. Subscribe to Navy Strikeforce if you want to understand why the machinery matters more than the headlines. Because what we are about to show you is the machinery. When Phelan walked out of the Pentagon on April 14th, the operational commanders did what operational commanders always do when civilian leadership evaporates. They defaulted to existing authorities and held position. Vice Admiral commanding Naval Forces Central Command in Bahrain had standing authorities for routine operations in the Gulf. The Carrier Strike Group commander aboard the Nimitz-class carrier operating south of the Strait of Hormuz continued executing the deployment orders that had been signed before Phelan's departure. But holding position is not the same as operating. And this is where most analysis of the situation stops one level too shallow. The distinction matters because the Navy does not operate in a static environment. Adversaries adapt. Iran, which has spent the last 3 years investing heavily in its fast attack craft fleet, its coastal missile batteries, and its drone program, watches Pentagon personnel announcements with the same intensity that Wall Street watches Federal Reserve nominations. The IRGC's intelligence apparatus does not need satellite imagery to understand what a leadership vacuum means. They read the Federal Register. They read Defense News. They read the Senate Armed Services Committee calendar. And what they read in mid-April 2026 was this: the United States Navy's civilian leadership chain had a gap. The Senate had no confirmation hearing scheduled, and the internal Pentagon politics around carrier procurement were generating friction at exactly the levels where deployment decisions get made. That is not a military vulnerability. It is an invitation to test. Here's where the obstacle appeared. Within 72 hours of Phelan's departure, CENTCOM reported an uptick in Iranian naval activity around Abu Musa Island and the Toonbi Islands, the three disputed territories that sit directly astride the shipping lanes at the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. The activity was not dramatic. It was calibrated. Additional fast attack craft sorties, a repositioning of coastal radar units, an increase in communications traffic between IRGC Navy headquarters at Bandar Abbas and forward operating positions. None of this crossed a red line. All of it was designed to probe, to see how quickly the American response chain would function when the person at the top of the civilian ladder was missing. The operational response was professional. The strike group adjusted its patrol patterns. P8. Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft increased their sortie rate. The destroyer screen tightened its spacing around the carrier. But the procurement response, the logistics response, the sustainment response, that is where the 11-day gap bit hardest. A carrier strike group at sea consumes approximately 22,000 meals per day across all ships in the formation. Fuel consumption for the escorts, not the nuclear-powered carrier, but the conventionally powered cruisers and destroyers, runs to hundreds of thousands of gallons per week. Ammunition expenditure in a heightened readiness posture is minimal, but ammunition certification cycles for certain precision-guided munitions have shelf-life windows that require periodic administrative renewal. Every one of those logistics chains has a funding line. Every funding line connects, eventually, to an authority that traces back through the Navy Secretariat. In peacetime, these connections are invisible. The machine runs on momentum. Contracts roll over. Funding authorities carry forward on inertia. Nobody notices the hand on the tiller because the sea is calm. But when the sea gets rough, when an adversary starts probing, when operational commanders need to extend a deployment by 30 days, when a destroyer needs an emergency drydock period authorized outside the normal maintenance cycle, the hand on the tiller matters. And for 11 days, the tiller was unmanned. Type tiller in the comments if you think civilian leadership gaps during active deployments should trigger an automatic Senate fast-track process. Most people assume the military chain of command is what matters in a crisis. The 4-star admiral commands the fleet. The combatant commander controls the theater. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs advises the president. That is the chain everyone sees in the movies. But the chain everyone sees in the movies is the warfighting chain. The other chain, the civilian chain, the chain that controls money, contracts, shipbuilding, and force structure, is the chain that determines whether the warfighting chain has anything to fight with. Here is an analogy that makes the equation concrete. The warfighting chain is the pilot. The civilian chain is the fuel supply, the maintenance crew, the factory that builds the aircraft, and the insurance policy that covers the airfield. The pilot can fly brilliantly, but if nobody is signing the checks that keep the fuel trucks running, the pilot eventually sits on a runway with an empty tank. The Secretary of the Navy is not the pilot. The Secretary is the person who makes sure the pilot has an airplane. Now, here is our take on what this episode reveals, and it is not about Phelan specifically. What strikes us about this situation is not that a political appointee was fired over a policy disagreement. That happens. It is supposed to happen. Civilian control of the military means civilian leaders make decisions. And when civilian leaders disagree with their bosses, the bosses win. That is the system working as designed. What the system did not design for is the gap. The system assumes that when one civilian leader departs, another is ready. Senate confirmation is supposed to be a filter. not a bottleneck. But when confirmation fights became political theater, nominees waiting months, acting officials serving in legal limbo, entire layers of the defense bureaucracy running without confirmed leadership for quarters at a stretch, the assumption of continuity became fiction. The Navy had 3 empty civilian chairs simultaneously. Not because of a national emergency, not because of a war, but because the confirmation pipeline had been clogged for months before Phelan's firing, and his departure simply removed the last plug holding the system together. And this is where the equation gets dangerous. Consider the Western Pacific. While the Gulf got most of the attention in the days after Phelan's departure, the carrier strike group operating in the Philippine Sea faced its own version of the problem. The strike group was approaching the end of its standard deployment window. Under normal circumstances, the extension decision, keeping the group on station for an additional 30 to 45 days, requires coordination between the fleet commander, the combatant commander, and the Navy Secretariat. The Secretariat's role is to authorize the funding shift that comes with extended operations, additional steaming days, accelerated maintenance timelines for the ships when they return, crew compensation adjustments. Without a secretary, and without a confirmed undersecretary, the authorization pathway was unclear. Fleet Forces Command in Norfolk reportedly sought guidance from the Office of the Secretary of Defense on whether the Deputy Secretary of Defense could exercise Navy Secretariat authorities in the interim. The answer took 4 days. 4 days in which the carrier strike group's deployment status was technically undetermined. The ships kept sailing. The aircraft kept flying. The sailors kept standing watch. But the bureaucratic architecture above them was holding its breath. Beijing noticed. We cannot say for certain what the PLA Navy's intelligence assessment concluded, but we can observe what happened. In the same week, Chinese naval exercises in the South China Sea, previously scheduled as a routine spring training cycle, expanded in scope. An additional destroyer squadron joined the exercise. A Type 075 amphibious assault ship, which had not been listed in the original exercise announcement, appeared in satellite imagery south of Hainan. Correlation is not causation. The Chinese Navy conducts exercises on its own timeline, but the expansion of a previously announced exercise in the same week that the U.S. Navy's civilian leadership chain fractured is the kind of correlation that intelligence analysts are paid to notice. Here is the controversial take that will probably earn us criticism in the comments, and we will say it anyway. The Ford-class debate that got Phelan fired was not actually about the Ford class. It was about whether the United States can sustain a global naval presence when political turnover moves faster than shipbuilding timelines. A carrier takes 7 years to build. A Secretary of the Navy, in the current political environment, lasts an average of 22 months. The carrier does not care who signed the contract. The carrier needs the contract signed. When the political cycle is shorter than the procurement cycle, when leaders rotate faster than the programs they oversee, the system does not produce ships. It produces studies, reviews, delays, and eventually a fleet that is smaller than the mission requires. Phelan understood this. That is why he refused to sign the delay. Not out of insubordination, but because the math did not work. Delay Enterprise by 3 years, and the carrier fleet drops below 11 deployable hulls in 2029. Drop below 11, and the rotation breaks. Break the rotation, and the Navy starts choosing Gulf or Pacific, not both. That is not a budget decision. That is a strategic decision. And it was being made not by the National Security Council, not by the President in a principals meeting, not by the Secretary of Defense in a formal force structure review, but by a procurement calendar that simply never got signed. The machinery behind the machinery. That is what this story is actually about. For 11 days, the 3-star and 4-star admirals commanding the fleet did their jobs. They executed standing orders. They responded to provocations with measured professionalism. They kept the carriers on station and the air wings flying. No crisis erupted. No shots were fired. No adversary crossed a line that forced a response without civilian authorization. The system held. But it held the way a bridge holds when you remove one of the support columns. It held because the load was light. Because Iran probed but did not push. Because China expanded an exercise but did not escalate. Because the weather in the Gulf was calm and the maintenance schedules had just enough slack. Put yourself in the fleet commander's shoes for a moment. You are a 3-star admiral in Bahrain. Your strike group is operating in a threat envelope. Your deployment window is approaching its limit. Your sailors have been at sea for 7 months. You need authorization to extend or authorization to rotate. Either answer works. What does not work is no answer at all. And for 11 days, you do not have the person who gives the answer. You have operational authority. You can fight the ship. You can defend the fleet. You can respond to any attack with overwhelming force. What you cannot do is extend a contract, approve a shipyard period, authorize an emergency procurement, or make a force structure recommendation that will shape the fleet you command 3 years from now. You are the most powerful naval officer in the most powerful navy in history, and you are waiting for a phone to ring. On April 25th, 11 days after Phelan's departure, the Department of Defense announced that a senior defense official, a political appointee with prior Navy experience, would serve as acting Secretary of the Navy pending a formal nomination. The announcement came with no timeline for a permanent replacement, no Senate hearing date, no indication of when the civilian chain would be fully restored. The immediate crisis passed. The procurement actions that had been frozen began to move again, though several had already slipped their contractual deadlines, triggering penalty clauses and renegotiation windows that cost the Navy, by one estimate we found in a Congressional Research Service sidebar, approximately $340 million in delayed delivery premiums and contract restructuring fees. $340 million because a desk was empty for 11 days. No enemy attack. No natural disaster. No strategic miscalculation. Run that equation one more time. The entire controversy started over whether to delay Enterprise by 3 years to save $1.8 billion. The 11-day leadership gap by itself cost $340 million in procurement friction. Scale that across a full year of degraded civilian oversight, acting officials without full authority, confirmation delays, political vacancies, and the cost asymmetry becomes clear. The Navy is not losing money to its enemies. It is losing money to its own vacancy rate. Here is what this means going forward, and here is the question that nobody in the Pentagon wants to answer publicly. The United States Navy is entering the most demanding operational period since the Cold War. The Pacific is heating up. The Gulf remains contested. The Atlantic, a strategic backwater for 30 years, is once again a theater requiring presence because of Russian submarine activity along the GIUK gap. The fleet is being asked to do more with fewer ships than at any point since 1990. And the civilian architecture that funds, builds, and sustains that fleet is running at roughly 60% staffing for confirmed political appointees across the Department of the Navy. 60%. Not because of a hiring freeze, not because of a lack of qualified candidates, but because the confirmation process has become a casualty of the same political friction that fired John Phelan. The war-fighting chain will hold. The admirals will command. The carriers will sail. The sailors will serve. But the machinery behind the machinery, the contracts, the shipyards, the procurement pipelines, the force structure decisions that take 7 years to build and 7 seconds to delay, that machinery needs a hand on the tiller. And right now, the question is not who will steer. The question is whether anyone will be confirmed fast enough to steer before the next wave hits. Subscribe to Navy Strikeforce. We do not celebrate weapons. We calculate whether they work. And right now, the most important calculation in the United States Navy has nothing to do with missiles, carriers, or kill chains. It is a simple question of arithmetic. Can the system replace its leaders faster than it fires them? That equation is still open.